Listen very carefully and follow my instructions. Prepare your brain for the live Cortex Nootropic podcast.
Alright, what's up everybody? It's me, Ryan Michael Ballo, and on this episode of the Live Cortex Nootropics podcast, we're going to talk about one of my favorite smart drugs on the roster, the almighty Noopept. Noopept has been around for quite some time, and is an actual smart drug versus a natural nootropic. I believe it was first synthesized in the country of Russia and patented in August of 1995. I experimented with Noopept a little bit back in the day, somewhere around 4 years ago, and I don't really remember noticing a benefit from it. I suspect, though, at the time, there were both a myriad of things I was doing wrong in terms of sleep and diet and other supplementation, and I know that I was nowhere near the amount of vigilance necessary to understand the degree of the complex B vitamin choline I needed in my diet, particularly in conjunction with taking Noopept, the basis of which we're going to get into a little bit later in this podcast. But I have since reignited my passion, my friends, and my interest into Noopept as a result of digging into a Noopept stash that I had sitting around from a company called Lift Mode and having a pretty interesting experience with it. There are a variety of variable experiences stemming from Noopept usage that we're going to talk about, ranging from HD vision, profoundly powerful memory and productivity, to the complete opposite side of the spectrum in some users experiencing short-term memory loss with the smart drug and all-around brain fog. We're going to get into all this stuff in this expanded view of the smart drug Noopept in this 009, my friends, the long-awaited of the Live Cortex Nootropics podcast, the power, science, and pitfalls of Noopept. I gotta tell you, having been an entrepreneur for 6 years, I will not go through the rest of my life without taking smart drugs. Aniracetam, piracetam, uridine monophosphate, Alcar, CDP choline. You can always have a better brain.
The Live Cortex Nootropic podcast is about to begin.
Alright everyone, jumping right into Noopept on this one. No podcast about Noopept or any smart drug compound with available science and mechanisms is sufficient without an in-depth explanation and perhaps a bit of hypothesizing about the mechanisms of action behind it. Since Noopept is rooted in scientists' attempt to improve upon the well-studied and historically used smart drug piracetam, it's similar to piracetam in terms of effects, but reported to be 1,000-fold more potent than piracetam. I recently reached out to the Nootropics subreddit community, which, by the way, is an incredible community with a lot of really smart people, to have someone point me in the right direction of some heavy research on Noopept and its origins, and kind of whatever else would be relevant to this podcast. And I got a remarkably succinct but powerfully detailed response from a user named Marianco, which lays out the following. Number one, the full nomenclature of Noopept is N-phenylacetyl-L-prolylglycine ethyl ester. Number two, though there is some confusion in the nootropics community and previous to this with me included, Noopept is not a racetam, nor was it the byproduct of a chemical alteration to the already existing smart drug piracetam. For some reason, I had the idea in my head that that was the case, but that's not the case. Racetams have, I'm probably going to super butcher this, but at least I preface it with a warning, a 2-oxopyrrolidine skeleton, whereas Noopept is a modified dipeptide with a completely different structure. Number three, the reasons that people confuse the two or tend to incorrectly group Noopept into the category of racetam is because they have similar mechanisms of action, not because they're chemically alike. This was the distinction that I was looking for in researching this because I was a bit confused about that too. Some people call it an analog of piracetam, which actually makes sense because it is comparable, but again, this is not a chemically altered or even chemically similar version of any racetam. Number four, and this is where it really gets interesting. Apparently, the body converts Noopept into 3 different molecules once you ingest it. They are phenylacetic acid, prolylglycine, if I'm saying that right. All this stuff's going to be on the Live Cortex post so that you can sort of read it and pronounce it, and cycloprolylglycine, which is naturally found in the human nervous system as it is. And according to this Reddit user who gave us all this information, it's the active nootropic component in Noopept responsible for the results that people get. So for those of you who can understand what some of this means and are interested in the exact mechanisms of action of cyclo or cycloprolylglycine, they are the following. Number one, it's a glutamate NMDA receptor blocker. Number two, it's a glutamate AMPA receptor blocker. Number three, it's an allosteric glutamate AMPA receptor agonist. Number 4, it suppresses calcium-gated potassium channels. Number 5, it suppresses voltage-gated calcium channels. And number 6, it can bind to calcium and magnesium ions. So I am a bit unsure how that translates to better brain function. I understand AMPA receptors, but when we get to like calcium-gated potassium channels, I'm kind of a little in the gray area. But I'm in the process of really learning about that stuff and getting more deeply into the AMPA receptors. So if you're curious about it and you know what to do, get out there and do the research yourself, my friends. But suffice it to say that Noopept turns into 3 main molecules, one of which is called cycloprologlycine, and that's the main component responsible for the nootropic effects of the compound. Now let's talk about dosages. Before we get into the effects of Noopept, which we're going to get to, and it's going to be awesome, the wide range of effects it seems to have across the nootropics community and the smart drugs experimenters out there, we got to clear up the dosages. So this drug is remarkably more powerful than its analogs and most other smart drugs in that the general recommended dose range is, get this, between 10 and 30 milligrams. 30 milligrams being on the super high end and 10 milligrams being the sort of starter dosage for people getting into the smart drug. I would certainly agree that the starter dosage for people looking to get into Noopept, I agree with it. I agree with 10 milligrams because, as we'll get into in a bit, there's a wide range of negative effects that come from taking the drug, and for some people, those are actual side effects, not positive nootropic effects. So small dose to start with and then work your way out to identify what dosages you can tolerate. If you're comfortable with 10 milligrams as a dose, but you want to see where else the compound can take you, and if it remains a smooth ride for you all along, then I'd suggest taking the dosage up in 3 milligram increments so that you can avoid any unwanted side effects or brain fog. The most common reported indicator of taking the quantity of Noopept overboard is brain fog in the form of short-term memory loss, which we're going to talk a lot about a little bit later. I suspect that this actually has to do with some sort of temporary overusage of a B vitamin or neurotransmitter that puts the brain in a place where it kind of can't compensate for the usage of that neurotransmitter or B vitamin with fast enough repletion. And from my perspective, at least right now, that's either vitamin B9, B12, or the neurotransmitter acetylcholine. We'll touch on that a little bit later, too. Now, dosages certainly change depending on the method of administration. Noopept generally comes in powder form, where you can measure it out on a milligram scale and then capsulize it and just throw it down. But a new trend in the nootropics community that I've been seeing is nasal spray administration methods, where a vendor will add deionized water to Noopept powder, shake it up, and call it Noopept nasal spray. I actually have experience with using such a concoction, and as far as I can tell, it is far more powerful this way than taking it orally and or sublingually. However, I do not suggest, nor do I advise doing this because, for one, I am not sure there's much research or any research behind this method of administration, and two, the creators of a Noopept, as far as I can tell from the literature, did not intend for the drug to be taken that way, and number one, repeated. Okay, there are no studies on it, so we really don't understand the safety, and that's not something you want to fuss with. There isn't much research behind this at all. That doesn't mean that people haven't tried it, because actually there's a wide range of anecdotal reports out there of people using Noopept nasal spray and experiencing some pretty great brain function as a result of it, and I'm one of them. After we talk about the effects of oral Noopept on me here in a bit, I'm going to read a clip from the Live Cortex Nootropics blog at livecortex.com/blog, where I detail my experience with experimenting with Noopept nasal spray. But if you are going to do the nasal spray route, then talk to your nootropics vendor or wherever you get the product from about the conversion rate and the adjusted dosage. The Noopept spray that I got, which is from a company called Limitless Life Nootropics, equaled out to be 1.5 milligrams per spray. But that doesn't mean I'd take 8 sprays of it to get 12 milligrams. It actually means that I'd take 2 sprays of it to get 3 milligrams, but that 3 milligrams is apparently more equivalent to the 13 milligrams of powder, according to the founder of Limitless Life Nootropics, a guy I'm connected to on Facebook called Christopher Michael Mercer, who explained all this stuff to me. Okay, let's talk about the wide range of effects reported by folks out there in the nootropics community, as well as how the compound affects me. So, aligned with the incredibly important notion of finding your exact sweet spot dosage, I found mine for oral Noopept, and it's 13 milligrams. After about 15 minutes or so after oral administration, which I take down by capsuling the Noopept powder in a single zero size capsule that I make with a capsule maker I bought from Amazon, I begin to notice the effects of Noopept. The most pronounced effect for me is the strong desire to read and get into something intellectual, which is totally awesome to me. I'm not I did pretty horrible in school, and these days I love reading research papers, but if I'm hanging out at home and it's like 7 p.m. and I'm kind of like wiped out for the day, like it's going to be hard to get me to want to like sit down and read 10 pages of a scientific paper. But I take Noopept and 15 minutes later, like I'm ready to go. I notice the working memory benefits almost instantly, and almost invariably I start getting into something that requires a good degree of comprehension. My favorite thing to do in these situations is read papers, read scientific papers, particularly on nootropic compounds, because that's what I love. I'll get into a study and just read the whole thing top to bottom, and not just the abstract. And what's cool about it is I retain like a great amount of the information that I read, whereas like under normal conditions, essentially operating from baseline, I'd retain and remember, I don't know, somewhere around 50% less, and I'd have to read like parts of the study a couple times to commit the important information into my long-term memory. I also notice a pleasantly powerful verbal recall benefit, which is like my thing. I love when I get a verbal fluency benefit from a nootropic, and I always like use that as a great marker for determining its efficacy. Streaming through the never-ending quantity of words in my vocabulary is a lot easier to do, and I do so like with a noticeably greater access to some of the words that I know and I've learned the definitions for, but that I like never use in my daily life. I'll use words that I just learned. I'll use words that I learned years ago and really haven't used in quite some time, and my ability to be articulate improves pretty rapidly, which is really awesome. I thoroughly enjoy this effect from Noopept because based on the constructs I've set up in my life, particularly running 2 businesses, both of which require a lot of good verbal recall and interaction with people, it's just like epic for me. I've actually been in situations where I was talking to executives of organizations I was trying to do business with, trying to sell them basically over the phone and in person, and my verbal recall from the Noopept dose that I took earlier in the day was like stellar, and helped me along to convince said executive or executives to use my company for a particular service set. One of the really interesting other effects that I get from Noopept is a mildly psychedelic feeling. It almost feels like I've been meditating for 45 minutes a day for a month straight. Because like for me, when I meditate consistently, that is when I can force myself to sit down and do it for a while. I always become a lot more connected to reality in a way that makes me theorize about things more and kind of like appreciate the finer details. I get really into it and I start really appreciating the things that are important to me, like the functioning of people's brains. As an example, I'll sit there at Starbucks or something while working and just stop and look at people that are reading books and like newspapers or whatever, and I'll just sit and like enjoy thinking about the notion that all of our brains are information vacuums, and if we set up the conditions correctly, we can take in a lot of cool information. And then I'll start thinking about things like if that information we take in determines who we become and shapes our personalities and goals in life and what we do, and I just start getting into that deep stuff, and I love going down those routes. It's like a much more substantive view of all the things in life that I can only explain as being, mildly psychedelic in nature and comparable to the states I get in when I do a lot of meditating. I also noticed that while on Noopept that I have a greater inclination and ability to think about and remember things that happened like way back in my past, which is super interesting. My long-term memory retrieval seems to be off the charts, and it seems a lot easier to access old memories. I sort of want to think about things from my past as a kind of game to demonstrate just how far I can go. And that in and of itself is mildly psychedelic, to just like think about all that stuff and go back to the days, when you're a kid and like start to sort of elicit all these memories you haven't thought of in a while. I mean, that's like trippy. It's kind of trippy. I'm overall more into my work when I take Noopept. I have a greater reading comprehension ability, and I function at a higher level in terms of verbal recall and working memory, so it's pretty awesome. But guys, I must say, I don't really dose with Noopept very often. I mean, first, I really don't feel the need to because I'm always taking a Cortex variant, be it Gen 1, the experimental stack for Generation 2, or a variant thereof. My favorite nootropic to date is uridine monophosphate, and that compound is so effective for me at basically inducing similar states and functionality to that of Noopept, minus some of the real meditation-like effects that come from it that I'm just like totally happy with uridine monophosphate. I will say though, uridine makes it easier for me to meditate, and that's one of the reasons I love taking Cortex and Cortex variants, because it allows a greater control over my brain so that when I sit down and meditate, it's a lot easier for me to get into that state. But suffice it to say that I probably dose with Noopept a few times per month. And that really isn't because I think there's something wrong with the safety profile of Noopept, or like that I hate it in some way. It's just that I have so many other weapons in my arsenal that I don't often feel the need for taking Noopept. These days I cycle between a simple caffeine and theanine stack, Cortex Gen 1 and its variants, adrafenil a couple times a month I've been getting into lately, which has been pretty interesting, and aniracetam and oxiracetam, all separately, of course. I'm a huge fan of acetyl L-carnitine. We did a podcast, I think it was 008, on the emperor of smart drugs, acetyl L-carnitine, and I get a great mental energy and motivating effect from taking it. All right, let's talk about where to get Noopept. There are a couple of vendors that sell Noopept, and though the purity differs among them, the effects seem to be relatively consistent to me. They are Lift Mode, a company I've used for probably about 2 years now, and ordering various nootropic compounds that have always delivered on great quality products on time that I really feel comfortable with because of that. I just get a warm and fuzzy when I think about Lift Mode. Powder City, which is a company a lot of us nootropics heads know about and have some really great products and have really become popular over the years. And a newer company called Limitless Life Nootropics, whose founder, we were just talking about before, Christopher Michael Mercer, recently sent me a bottle of their Noopept Nasal Spray that we're going to talk about here. That was pretty amazing, and I'm going to really detail my experience with it here in a bit. Remember to find your sweet spot dose and titrate up and down to get the best effects from Noopept. I mean, if there's anything that's super important that you take away from this podcast, it's that. I mean, that's what I really want to get across. It should also be noted that based on the anecdotal reports out there on the web, some people are going to need to take some form of choline while taking Noopept, basically theoretically on the acetylcholine sensitizing nature of the compound. I mean, that's kind of my theory on it, which might force the brain to use more acetylcholine and thus create the need to replete it while taking Noopept. I really don't know the exact mechanism behind this, nor do I know if it's actually true, but the anecdotal reports out there speak volumes to this phenomenon, and the verdict is some people do a lot better with Noopept taking with a choline source, so experiment accordingly. Okay, so before we get into my experience with Noopept nasal spray, I want to quick mention some potential downsides of taking Noopept. There are a contingent of people for whom taking Noopept gives them intense brain fog. People report lack of clarity and even outcomes as severe and profound as short-term memory loss. This obviously isn't good, but I think we need to not jump to conclusions that it's the compound that isn't safe, and think about other components of neurological functioning in response to perhaps the usage of extra neurological compounds. While a lot of the safety ideas originate from the same Russian scientists that created the compound, there seems to be a quantity of anecdotal reports on the web of people that take the substance frequently and only report great benefits. Also, as I mentioned so far in this podcast, Noopept might be using up extra acetylcholine in your brain. I mean, that's one of the things that I think about of neurological components. Or, is forcing you to use like more of a particular B vitamin, which could cause some of these negative effects. I mean, they could definitely cause those effects. So one really has to consider the idea that their chemistry is reacting negatively to Noopept, and that there's a way to fix that via ensuring optimal neurotransmitter quantity in the case of acetylcholine, or optimal B vitamin profile, which could mean B9, could mean B6, could mean B12, or other Bs. But there are a few users that have reported this short-term memory loss that I want to quick mention here on this podcast to kind of give you an idea of the possibilities here. This comes from a user on the Nootropics subreddit who started a thread titled "Noopept Affecting Short-Term Memory." He says, "Lately, I have been experiencing my short-term memory becoming really bad. Can this be because of Noopept? I've been taking it sublingually with 250 milligrams of alpha GPC. The problem is I'm not exactly sure about the dosage. I've been trying to dose around 10 milligrams of Noopept, but it's really difficult to accurately measure on my scale." Check this out. He says, "I ordered microscoops, parentheses 10 milligrams, from Amazon.com, but my package came through empty. I can't seem to find any place in Scandinavia that sell microscoops either." Apparently this person is from Scandinavia, and he ordered it from Amazon US. Is Noopept known to have negative effects on short-term memory if taken in the wrong dosages? And if, we're going to link to this below on livecortex.com, but the consensus on that thread seems to be that this user is taking too much Noopept based on the fact that he can't accurately measure what he's taking down. But still, this highlights the significance of this well-known caveat that if you are not at your sweet spot dose for Noopept, then there might be side effects, and one of them might be temporary short-term memory loss. Another user titled a thread "Noopept First Experience and Short-Term Memory Problems." It goes like this. "I recently just purchased some Noopept from New Star Nootropics. Yesterday at about 4 p.m., I took a sublingual dose measured from the included 10 to 15 milligram scoop along with 300 milligrams of CDP choline. I know this is not the preferred way to measure, and as a result, a milligram resolution scale is on the way. After about 20 minutes, I was immediately more focused and alert. For the rest of the evening, felt almost compelled to do something intellectual. So I sat down to do a derivation I had been putting off and get some technical reading done. Not sure what a derivation is, but maybe sort of spelled something wrong. He was trying to say something else, but I mean, that's what he wrote on this Reddit thread. As the evening wore on, I began to have increasing problems with my short-term memory. I would have to reread things multiple times, and I would forget what I was doing frequently and have to spend a good 20 or 30 seconds to let it come back to me. Eventually, it got to the point where I just had to stop working because I wasn't able to remember enough to be productive. Strangely, the desire to keep working persisted, and sitting down to relax made me agitated. This feeling lasted through the morning, and my memory is still a bit off. I'm going to suspend taking Noopept until I feel like myself again, and then try lowering the dose to 5 milligrams. Is this in line with what anyone else here experienced? Any advice to someone new to Noopept? Have microdose doses below 5 milligrams worked for any of you? ? And users on that thread go on to caution against larger doses, but others cite similar experience with regular doses. This user reports a short-term memory loss, memory issues all the way to the next morning, which to me continues to move me in the direction that Noopept is merely temporarily creating some kind of deficiency in a B vitamin or the neurotransmitter acetylcholine or some other crucial component of memory function. I have actually gotten short-term memory loss from certain nootropic compounds before, only to come to understand that they were using up an extra B vitamin that I was already deficient in at a higher rate. So I started taking, in response to this, methylated forms of that B vitamin while taking said nootropic, and boom, the problem was solved. Then there's a thread on longevity where a user reports taking regular doses of Noopept and functioning really, really well for the first day, and then suffering pretty noticeable short-term memory loss the next day. All right, we'll link to all the individual threads and their stories here on the Live Cortex blog on this post. Find this post if you're on YouTube by searching the title of this podcast in the search bar at livecortex.com/blog, so you can check out those links and read those people's stories. So my overall assessment on the possibility of side effects is they're definitely there. And though it may be related to dosing in some cases, in some other cases it doesn't seem to be. We've obviously got people taking regular 10 milligram doses and running into short-term memory impairments for brief periods of time after taking the drug. So you need to be aware if you're going to experiment with Noopept about these potential side effects. Overall, though, as I mentioned, I think there is always a reason for things like this, whether it's dosing or it's my acetylcholine or vitamin B issue theory, or it's some other thing that's fixable that you just kind of need to experiment with, that people just need to target. I mean, if you're hell-bent on finding the right dose of Noopept for you, and you run into some of these problems, then you're just going to have to granularly experiment to find out what works. As you're about to find out in this blog post, I'm going to read on the Noopept nasal spray version of Noopept my experience with it. I had some brain fog and unwanted side effects too, but it's basically from essentially dosing too high based on the massive bioavailability of sending the compound in liquid form up my nose. So without further ado, let's get into my experience with Noopept nasal spray. I'm going to read from you the entire blog post on a post that I did on livecortex.com where I detailed my experiences, my dosages, and everything else related to my experience with Noopept nasal spray. Here we go. I have been hearing about Noopept nasal spray for quite some time now. I hadn't really paid any attention to it because the oral method of administration with nootropics and smart drugs is both sufficient and predictably safe for me. I know just what I'm getting into and how it's going to affect me, but recently someone I'm newly connected to on Facebook who owns a company called Limitless Life Nootropics that sells smart drugs and nootropic compounds reached out to me to send me a sample of their Noopept nasal spray. The owner, a one Christopher Michael Mercer, seems highly focused on purity and quality, which is a really cool thing. So when he sent me this certificate of analysis for their Noopept compound, and it was like 0.5% above the standard, which is 99%, rendering their product 99.5% pure, I was into the idea of trying it, and I did. And it was an interesting experience, but I'll get into all that in a second. First, though, what is Noopept? What is the Noopept smart drug? And guys, let me just jump out for a second and say I'm about to reiterate a few things that we talked about already, but I think it's important to say these things again. Simply put, Noopept is a smart drug compound that improves focus, memory, verbal recall, and has some anti-anxiety properties. It converts to a few different chemicals in the body, but the primary and compound responsible for its efficacy is cycloprologlycine, which is an endogenous peptide that modifies the acetylcholine system and AMPA receptors in the brain in a positive way. Thanks to a Reddit user in our Nootropics, I actually managed to snag a list of some of the mechanisms of action behind cycloprologlycine, and they are: number 1, it's a glutamate NMDA receptor blocker. Number 2, it's a glutamate AMPA receptor blocker. Number 3, it's an allosteric glutamate AMPA receptor agonist. Number 4, it suppresses calcium-gated potassium channels. Number 5, it also suppresses voltage-gated calcium channels. Number 6, and it also suppresses voltage-gated potassium channels. And cycloprologlycine can bind to calcium ions and magnesium ions. In the end, these mechanisms, and the Reddit user Marianko mentioned that it wasn't even a full exhaustive list, and more, are responsible for the effects one gets while taking Noopept. It also stimulates the expression of nerve growth factor and brain-derived neurotrophic factor, two of the most interesting elements of brain function involved in neuronal regulation and growth. The compound is unregulated and thus unscheduled as far as I can tell in the US, rendering it legal to use and buy. Its safety is assured by one of its co-creators, a woman named Rita Ostrovskaya. I'm sure I butchered that too. A Russian neuroscientist with a background in molecular biology. And there are years of anecdotal reports on the web of nootropics experimenters taking the substance, and though some side effects are reported that seem to be temporary or transient, the drug seems to be well tolerated otherwise. At the bottom of this post, we'll list some of those links to some users' negative experience on Noopept if you're interested. And by the way, I'm jumping out of the post again and saying that's the stuff we just talked about, some of those negative experiences. But again, if you want to find this post, just Google Live Cortex and Noopept Nasal Spray, and you will find this post, and you can read the links on some of those negative experiences on that page too. Okay, getting into my experience with Noopept Nasal Spray. I should first start off by saying the potency of Noopept Nasal Spray is far more than oral administration, which is taken via capsule. The dose range for oral Noopept is between 10 and 30 milligrams twice or 3 times daily. I usually only dose with the compound once per day at 13 milligrams, which is my sweet spot that I've experimented to find, and it's pretty delightful. I normally experience drastic improvements in verbal recall, working memory, reading comprehension capacity, and overall connection with life when taking oral Noopept. It's mildly psychedelic for me in that it sort of makes me think deeper into things and exacerbates the already highly functional philosopher in me. It's pretty cool. But using the nasal administration protocol for Noopept was some other thing entirely. Let me explain. First, the dosing is different. So where I normally require 13 milligrams orally, with nasal spray I only require 3 milligrams, which is 2 sprays. The founder of Limitless Life Nootropics explained to me that each spray is 1.5 milligrams of Noopept, but that 3 milligrams of Noopept spray, which is 2 sprays, is about equivalent to 13 milligrams of oral Noopept, which is my sweet spot dose. However, when dosing with 2 sprays, I experienced a profoundly annoying tiredness that came on almost immediately and lasted about 30 minutes. It wasn't a great experience at all, and I'll tell you why that happened. That wasn't my sweet spot. As I laid out above, and I want to be clear, this is directly from the owner of Limitless Life Nootropics, 3 milligrams of the spray, which is 2 sprays, is roughly equivalent to 13 milligrams of oral Noopept. But I actually think it's a little more potent than that. Perhaps 2 sprays was similar to 15 to 20 milligrams of oral Noopept for me, and that's why I experienced a pronounced tiredness from 2 sprays. But the rest of that experience was actually quite pleasant. The tiredness subsided in 30 minutes, and what was left over was a pronounced anxiolytic effect, one that I've never felt before. I was super calm and just okay with things, content, and I was satisfied. And I'm never that way. I'm a ruthlessly busy entrepreneur with large goals. I own 2 national companies, and I rarely give myself an entire day off. My mind is always thinking about how I can improve things, solve problems, or move forward in some way. But the anxiolytic effect brought on by this batch of Noopept nasal spray changed all of that. It felt as if I had recovered from burnout, a state that I get in sometimes when I've worked myself to the bone and haven't given myself the time to play and or relax. And this was a pretty interesting position. But there was still the initial period of tiredness, which kind of made me curious of the notion that I simply required a different dose to get my normal functional benefits from Noopept, perhaps a smaller dose. In line with the position a good nootropics experimenter should have, which is ruthless experimentation and endless titrating until a perfect dose is found, I kept trying. The next logical strategy would be to dose with one spray and see what comes of it. So I waited 24 hours and did so. And guys, that was my sweet spot. One spray of Noopept nasal and I was totally on my way. It essentially mimicked my normal 13 milligram dose with oral Noopept, and it seemed to onset a bit quicker and kind of feel a bit cleaner. I had my verbal fluency benefits, my working memory benefits, my reading comprehension improvements as usual, and it was quite the delightful experience. This highlights the importance of finding your sweet spot. In many of the various nootropics forums on the web, I see people making the mistake of deeming a smart drug ineffective after a mere dose of the compound. One needs to consider and experiment with various dosages, understand most of the cofactors involved in the synthesis of the neurotransmitters involved in the effects of the compound, and adjust and prepare accordingly. So, all that said, I found my sweet spot dose. I was able to have a good experience with Limitless Life Nootropics Noopept Nasal Spray. To be clear, I have no financial affiliation with the company, but I do have an affinity for Noopept and think it's a very interesting compound. Overall, would I use the Noopept Nasal Spray on a daily basis? No, because I believe in cycling and I rotate a bunch of different smart drugs and nootropics into my routine throughout the month, but this will be a great addition to store in that arsenal and to break out when applicable. My experience with Limitless Life Nootropics version of it was great. The whole experience was great, really. The founder of the company was really cordial and punctual and informative, and the product is damn good. Thanks for reading. And then I have on the bottom there kind of just what we talked about earlier in the podcast, anecdotally reported side effects of Noopept. I've compiled a short list of anecdotally reported side effects of taking Noopept for those of you interested. I think it's important to note that for some people, this is a wonder drug, and I actually linked to a place where somebody talks about it being a wonder drug for them. And for others, it's a complete disaster. It should also be considered that for a lot of people that report side effects, their dose range is either on the high end of the recommended dose or way out of that range. It's also a theory of mine, reiterating guys, that Noopept could possibly expose an underlying B vitamin deficiency, and that is partially responsible for some of the negative effects people are getting in the below and elsewhere experiences. I'll go on to say at the end, and this is really what I want to say to everybody here, there's a final cautionary note and notice, and here it is. Though this method of administration seems to be well tolerated, in the small subset of people in the nootropics community that have sampled it, me included, this was not how the creators of the compound intended for it to be ingested. There are no studies that I know of that discuss the safety or efficacy of this method of Noopept administration. In trying nasal Noopept spray, you are doing so at your own risk. And that is the end of the article, folks. Again, I think the compound's amazing. I have great experiences with it when I find my sweet spot dose. And like some of these other people have talked about some of these negative effects that they might have from taking Noopept, I've experienced some of them too, but it was because either I didn't have the choline source right, I didn't have the choline quantity right, and preparation and dose-related factors were just not on point. Once I got all of that stuff on point, like I understood what choline source to take and what quantity, or if I wasn't going to take a choline source, if I ate like an omelet for breakfast and later on decided that I was going to take Noopept, I wouldn't take a choline source, and I was good to go on that. Once I found my perfect sweet spot in terms of dosing, I was totally on my way, and Noopept is amazing. But again, it's super important for you to experiment with the right doses, the right choline sources, kind of what other elements in the environment, in your own sort of eating environment and sleeping environment and supplement environment set up the sort of conditions for you to have a great experience with Noopept. It's good. All nootropics users should essentially approach taking nootropics with that exact strategy. How do I set up the conditions for this to work optimally every time? It's not that you should look at any nootropic compound, and go, I'm going to take this nootropic and it's either going to work or not work. And if it doesn't work, then that means that this nootropic is ineffective. Definitely not. Nootropics are different. It's not like vitamins, or it's not like, something else in a sort of similar category. It's much more that it's your responsibility. You kind of assume responsibility. If you really want to be optimal with nootropics, Noopept included, you got to assume responsibility for titrating doses and finding what works for you and setting up the best conditions. But overall, I don't want to make this sound like a Noopept bashing podcast, but I want to be very, very clear. As some of you know, but those of you who know me personally or listen to any of the content we put out, the videos we put out on YouTube, I try to be as extremely objective as possible, and I just want people to understand what they're getting into. Again, though, my overall view of Noopept is that it's pretty amazing. It's got a lot of research behind it. I think that the creators, the co-creator, that Rita woman we talked about earlier, had great intentions, and they are some on-point individuals. And I believe that this has really great application for people in a myriad of situations, so long as you've got your dose correct. I thoroughly enjoy having Noopept as both oral Noopept and the nasal spray. I mean, we'll see about using the nasal spray again. I really don't have I don't have a desire to use the nasal spray method of administration. I don't have a necessity to use the nasal spray method of administration, but maybe in a pinch, if I can't kind of whoop out powder and pull a milligram scale out and measure it, I might keep the nasal spray around for situations like that. But in general, like I said before, in my arsenal of smart drugs and nootropic compounds, I'm definitely going to keep Noopept in there because you know what? Since I found my right dose, it's actually a really delightful experience. All right, folks, that might have been record-breaking there for the longest live Cortex Nootropics podcast we've put out so far. That is the podcast on Noopept. I really hope that you guys enjoyed it. If you want to check out the Noopept nasal spray blog post that I did, just go to livecortex.com/blog and search for Noopept nasal spray in the search bar. You can Google Live Cortex and Noopept nasal spray as well. The company that I got the nasal spray from is again called Limitless Life Nootropics, but there's also another vendor called Serotropic, who has been around for quite some time and sells nootropic compounds, bulk powder, etc., who also sells a version of Noopept nasal spray. So you've got a couple options out there. If you have not tried the Cortex Nootropics Stack, the Cortex Nootropics Stack is a stack that we formulated, if you haven't heard about it, with uridine monophosphate, CDP choline, a titch of artichoke extract, and some Bacopa monnieri. The primary thing to take away from thinking about this stack is that uridine monophosphate and CDP choline synergize in an amazing way that creates profoundly good brain function. I've been taking the stack on and off for 7 or 8 months. The stack has been, now that we've got the stack launched and it's out there commercially available, hundreds of people have bought bottles and love it. I mean, people are sending me emails like, I have taken Alpha Brain, I've taken Siltep, I've taken this, I've taken that, I've taken Aniracetam. None of them are as effective as Cortex. I really love the stack. I want to take it every day, and I'm like super excited about it. People will call me and say it's giving me massive productivity in this area of my job, and it's really making a difference. I know a speaker who works for a cybersecurity company that's all she does is go and give speeches for a living, and she's like, my ability to go up there and remember what I got to say and to be calm about it, and my verbal fluency and releasing or in formulating my sentences is just stellar. And she's like, Ryan, thank you for creating this nootropic. It's amazing. And so a lot of people have a lot of great results from taking the Cortex stack. Snag yourself a bottle at livecortex.com. You're not going to regret it. It is a powerful product, and you are going to love it. For those of you who are interested, we are working on Generation 2, and I got to say, the onset of Generation 2, because I'm working with Generation 2 experimentals every day, just sort of tweaking the dosages and trying to make it right, is insane. I mean, the onset is 20 minutes, and we're the whole goal behind Gen 2. The goal behind Gen 1 was essentially a mild version of modafinil, but with elements of it that actually improve brain function over time, like inducing neurite outgrowth, which is the branching of axons between neurons, and inducing neurogenesis, something that uridine monophosphate and CDP choline do. But the idea was to make it a milder form in terms of effects, sort of acute subjective effects of modafinil. But I gotta say, Gen 2, the goal with Gen 2 is to make it essentially a natural form of full strength modafinil. Like, you take it and you're just like, wow, like this is blowing my mind and making my brain work very powerfully. And I got to tell you, so far with experimentation on Gen 2, I'm making it happen. Okay, we've got, for those of you who are wondering, we're adding caffeine to the stack. Of course, not to rely on caffeine, but based on the components, the additional components we're going to put in that stack, caffeine is a very important molecule for that synergy, and it's going to be amazing. So look forward to that. On YouTube, we've got a channel where we're launching videos. If you're listening to this on YouTube, we put these podcast videos up eventually. Please subscribe to the YouTube channel. We need to grow that channel as much as possible. Please send us or give us a review on iTunes. If you're listening to this on iTunes, we would really appreciate it. And that's it. Share the post on Twitter if you have the opportunity to do so, because that helps our SEO, our search engine optimization, which ultimately ends up bringing this good content out to as many people as possible, and that is the goal. Thank you so much for coming, guys. We'll talk to you next time.
Pick up a
a bottle of the Cortex Nootropic at www.livecortex.com.